Today we are covering the emotional drivers behind POTS. POTS stands for postural tachycardia syndrome, and it's an abnormality in the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. Welcome back to the Mind Change Podcast. I'm your host, Heather McKean. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, download, and comment. It really helps us to continue to create all this great content for you, and it helps us know what kind of topics you are most interested in hearing about. Now, a malfunctioning ANS, or autonomic nervous system, is also sometimes called dysautonomia. So you will sometimes hear the terms POTS and dysautonomia used interchangeably. The autonomic nervous system controls all bodily functions that we don't have to think about, such as heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, bladder control, sweating, and our stress responses. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system produces the fight, flight, or freeze response. When activated, a chemical called norepinephrine is released. Amongst other things, this causes an increase in heart rate and blood pressure. Breaking down the name a bit, for POTS, postural tachycardia syndrome. So postural means the position of the body. Tachycardia means fast heart rate. Syndrome is a combination of symptoms. It's estimated that POTS affects 1 to 3 million people in the United States. POTS is more common in women than men, with 80% of people with POTS being female. Most people diagnosed with POTS are diagnosed between the ages of 15 and 25. So we're looking at a syndrome that typically affects young women. Now, this is important when considering emotional drivers. Of course, POTS can also affect men, but from a mind change perspective, we can often look at cultural, familial, and societal influences that may have been passed down that typically play out in young women. Now, what I find fascinating is that POTS is a relatively new condition. It was originally characterized in 1993, but the condition was recognized first in 1940. So early descriptions of what we now know to be POTS were actually linked to Civil War soldiers, and they had orthostatic and gastrointestinal symptoms that for various reasons stood out and could be combined to say, hey, something here is going on that's unique to the normal functioning of these people. And then within the group of Civil War soldiers as a whole, this particular population is showing these kinds of symptoms. So orthostatic and then gastrointestinal symptoms. In 1940, a physician and researcher with the last name Lowe and some of his colleagues at the Mayo Clinic described a condition which we now know to be POTS. Previously, it was known by other names, including orthostatic tachycardia, neurocirculatory asthenia, and soldier's heart. Soldier's heart was a former medical diagnosis that was used to describe a group of symptoms that included an overstimulated heart, anxiety, and trouble breathing. It was also known as irritable heart. Again, this diagnosis came from Civil War veterans who began showing a collection of similar symptoms linked to their time at war. Obviously, these were presumably all men. And it was further linked to a form of absolute exhaustion, the needing to push the body through things that the mind was having a hard time handling. Now, somewhere along the line, we have seen a switch from a male-dominated, war-related symptomology to a young female-dominated symptomology. It's also important to consider the increase in occurrence and diagnosis. Only 20 to 30 years ago, a POTS diagnosis was extremely rare. Today, it's recognized as common. Again, this is fascinating. To be put in very simple terms, it is my belief that what we are seeing is a symptomology of unprocessed trauma. And a lot of it is generational trauma. The overall emotional driver for POTS is our relationship with nurturing. Do we feel, or have we felt, worthy of love, nurturing, care, focus, attention? Now, to me, this actually makes a lot of sense if we take POTS back to its inception. Remember, it's first recognized in Civil War soldiers. Now, these soldiers faced horrific trauma. War, of course, will always be traumatic. But uniquely for the Civil War, this was a war against fellow countrymen, people who looked like them. They were possibly neighbors or even relation to some degree. They spoke the same language. They had the same culture. So adding all of that to the fact that this was close range, face-to-face combat. The Library of Congress says that almost as many Americans were killed in the Civil War as in all of the nation's other wars combined. So for Civil War soldiers, they faced other things that were unique to the Civil War. For instance, disease with little to no medical care. Deprivation of all kinds. So they had substandard clothing, substandard equipment, and sometimes little to no food. And then the food they did have was sometimes riddled with maggots or mold or had gone bad. So another condition of the Civil War is that there were no backup forces and there was little to no foreign aid. So for these soldiers, every basic human need was being sacrificed to this war effort as a soldier. Plus the fact that they were having the kind of combat that we talked about with the kind of people that they were fighting against. So really what this did was it exhausted them on every possible level. This wreaked havoc on their body's internal defense and warning system. So they became overloaded and hypervigilant. And of course, this affected their heart. And I would say not just on a biological level, on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, every level of connection to one's heart would have been affected for these Civil War veterans. Now, if we consider another main driver of POTS, is that there's a force, situation, or dynamic, or a person that has, in the individual's mind, has gotten bigger than life itself. They feel engulfed by a situation or a person or environment. They feel controlled. They feel like they have completely lost their own agency or power or autonomy. Now, I think this makes a lot of sense from a war situation. But how has this shifted from a soldier's syndrome to one that primarily affects young women? Again, I think this has a lot to do with generations of unhealed and unprocessed trauma. But also consider, many of us are at war. We're at war within our minds, and it alters the way we perceive safety and survival. These days, women are twice as likely to suffer from an anxiety disorder. Many people feel on a foundational level that they give far more than they receive. Remember, the brain doesn't understand the difference between a bear that we meet on a hiking trail or the stress of passing a test or even what we perceive as stress or threat by being unliked from a friend. Our conscious mind sees big differences in those things. But if we're conditioned to be more anxious or hypervigilant, we're going to see much more of a susceptibility to having our perceptions lean toward danger. So what does this have to do with nurturing? Well, for children, if they're raised in a home where there is disorganized, anxious, or unsafe attachments with a primary caregiver, especially the mother, they are much more prone to fear, worry, and anxiety. If love or nurturing were conditional or transactional, this can establish a deep belief that the child is only worthy of love, care, and nurturing if they can perform at high acceptable levels. So let's get into a few more of the childhood drivers behind POTS. So in childhood, you may not have felt like you received nurturing the way that you needed, and your body has been desperately longing for it ever since. You may have felt unable to communicate the level of dysfunction you perceived or felt in your family unit. You may have felt unable to communicate the level of dysfunction you perceived or felt in your family unit to others for fear of causing trouble. So this could be a number of things such as abuse, manipulation, lies, or a family trying to look perfect to outsiders, but being an unsafe environment behind closed doors. In an ideal situation, a child in an environment that feels unsafe in any way in the home should have people that they can go to, people that they can speak to about this, and the people that they could speak to would have an influence in maybe helping the situation at home. But for many people, that's not the case. For many people growing up, you keep the family drama. You keep what happens in the family secret from anybody else. And that's very often the case in situations where there's dysfunction or abuse or manipulation or fits of anger and various things in the family unit, that it's not to be let out to the outside. Children, even if they're not told this directly, will understand this implicitly. And then not only are they victims of that home environment, which goes against the way that they were designed to feel self-regulated and to learn to be functional in their particular safety systems in their body, but now also there's this belief that there's nobody out there that can help them. Another situation this sometimes occurs can be in either high-profile families or religious families where there's an expectation of the world sees us this way, and we're this way presented outside as a family. But in the home environment, things go very, very differently. So that kind of push-pull hypocrisy plays on children in a way that really affects their safety systems and around their relationship with themselves and with nurturing. Now, around the relationship with control, people who do POTS may have felt that there was no way to get out of certain commitments that they were pressured into accepting. So the way that this could manifest is they could have had expectations placed upon them with, let's say, sports or academics or even hobbies. And this can often play out also in religious participation. It could also be that you were made to spend time with family, friends, or family members who did not feel like safe people. So as a child, you would have maybe felt these feelings like, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to participate in this. I don't want to go to this, or I don't want to spend time with these people, or I have an issue with this particular person, or I don't want to touch this person or hug this person or do this thing. And rather than those feelings being honored or explored, or even at the base level just heard and acknowledged, the children were pushed into performance, and that then would teach the child that they can't trust their own judgment, their own intuition, their own feelings in their body, and that would eventually lead to them having a hard time trusting themselves or knowing who is safe and who might not be safe. Also with POTS, there may have been a lot of judgment or criticism in your family of origin. Over time, a child would learn to expect and anticipate the criticism, and then assume that all communication or relationship comes with judgment. This can feel like your life was under constant scrutiny and you could never do anything right or you couldn't make mistakes. And of course, this only reinforces a belief that might be there that you're not worthy of love or nurturing. This can result in people having poor personal boundaries as children. So you become unable or unwilling to communicate clearly or honestly with others or yourself about what your true thoughts, feelings, desires are, and then especially around painful issues. So if you weren't able to speak those truths and have those truths heard and respected and acknowledged within your home, then you aren't taught how to have personal boundaries. If it's kind of a my way or the highway with parents or family members, then oftentimes that leads to someone who has a hard time standing up for themselves because they equate saying no to someone with rejection or abandonment. And then you've got the person who's desperately wanting unconditional love and nurturing. And if saying no or speaking up for themselves leads to rejection or abandonment or further abuse, then saying no is just not an option any longer. And obviously, going into adulthood, that can affect the person in a lot of ways. Another main driver with POTS could be that the family depended on you as their lifeline. They responded by the person, the child who is relied upon in this heavy way would have rose to that challenge or taken that on at all costs, right? So sometimes this happens when there might be a family situation where someone is an addict or there is someone in the family who is abusive, and then the child, one of the children, is looked at to be kind of like another adult or a buffer in some way. This can also happen if possibly one or more of the parents is mentally challenged in the sense of mental health issues or physical issues. If you've got a chronically ill parent, then oftentimes one or more of the children will take that role on of being another parent. And that's just too overwhelming for a little person's system. And what that does is it teaches the child to put their own wants, needs, and desires on the back burner. And in childhood is not the place to be doing that. In childhood, it's the place to be learning boundaries, to be learning and understanding that as a being, I am unconditionally loved, unconditionally cared for, and connected to. So again, this is very common that we see people taking on one of these roles through divorce as well. When there's a divorce, the family splits, and a child is living with a single parent, again, oftentimes they are forced to become more of a parental role. So that actually plays out in a lot of situations. Sometimes differently and sometimes similarly. It can be, a driver can be that the family may have treated you more like you were a resource to be relied upon instead of a child needing nurturance, support, protection, and guidance and training. And again, there can be many more childhood drivers, but those are some of the key drivers for someone who ends up doing dysautonomia or a related condition like POTS. Now, if we fast forward some of these drivers in childhood into adulthood, we see these manifest in numerous ways. For instance, someone who's doing POTS likely has a fundamental inconsistency in their relationship with love, acceptance, and nurturing. It comes and goes, and the it being love, and you can't seem to maintain a steady, reliable sense of love or being loved. And that reflects the instability of the close nature of the relationship with your family. Now, if you think about that, and you have this inconsistent relationship with love and care and nurturing in all relationships, based on some of that from your family, then what happens is you've got all of that happened in your family and in your childhood and the beliefs that makes you feel about yourself. But now you're an adult. And these relationships that are now with friends, colleagues, coworkers, romantic interests start playing out a lot of the same story that we saw in childhood. So different players in the particular scene, but the same storyline happening over and over again. And because we're talking about love, it's worth mentioning that how often we hear a metaphoric representation of love being in our heart, right? Like our heart hurting if there's heartbreak with love, or our heart filling and being full, and sometimes hurting in a way of stretching when we are loving people or in a state of love. And so our heart is deeply connected to this relationship we have around love. So the fact that we are talking basically about a heart condition here when we're talking about POTS or dysautonomia, it makes sense that this would be connected back to this kind of relationship. Another adult manifestation and driver that we see of POTS is someone who lives in a fairly constant state of overwhelm, even if it's just subconscious. So this overwhelm sets your filters and bias of reactions to things feeling and seeming severely threatening or traumatic when they come in. So for this person, let's take a younger person, the getting a bad grade, rather than feeling like, oh, I could disappoint my parents and this is disappointing, this feels like severely threatening or traumatic to this child's body. That we bring that into adulthood, it's things like arguments or disagreements or being given feedback on your job from a boss. All of that feels, for someone who has the basis of the drivers that we were talking about previously coming into adulthood, that really sets the stage for them to have this information come in as threatening to their very survival, rather than just fairly normal feedback that happens when you have relationships with people. For these people, because of that constant state of threat and perceived threat, their limits of ability have been exceeded. So really, in that sense, their whole operating system is malfunctioning in a frantic attempt to regain some semblance of what they perceive to be security, safety, and control. So anything outside of a pretty small set of parameters can feel like a threat to their entire survival system. And of course, this is that we're really talking about how that affects our heart and our relationship with our autonomic nervous system. Another driver we see in adults for a POTS diagnosis is that you feel that you have been required to live at the extreme edge of a situation, environment, or relationship that has continuously pushed you to exceed your abilities. What I mean by that is, remember that some of the drivers here are children who took on too much responsibility at too early of an age, coupled with the fact that they didn't learn self-boundaries or personal boundaries, and that saying no is not an option. So these people become adults and they tend to overcommit, and they're also over sensitive, if you will, to certain things because they're perceiving them as threats. So they're having all these things perceived as threats, but don't have the ability to connect with themselves and their gut and say what is safe and what is not safe. They're used to being pushed past their normal limits. So they go ahead and push past their normal limits all the time. And that exceeds their capacity. And that wreaks havoc on the system and on the body. Now, it's their normal, so they don't perceive that it could be something they are doing. It just really feels like the world is too much, too big. The expectations of a job, a relationship, all these various things. This is oftentimes we see this occurring in younger people who are moving into more responsibility or more adult situations for these diagnoses to come up because the body already feels at max capacity. All right, another driver here is you have the belief that you are a self-made person, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps type, and that you've made it this far, not being able to rely on anybody else. So you're all you've got. That really plays into, again, expanding capacity beyond what our normal limits might be. Another driver is that you feel like you're cut off from your environment or your community or the universe, that's kind of been happening all your life. You're always kind of seeing yourself as different or othered than the people around you. It might make a belief that you've had to work harder than others. Therefore, you have felt like you have to handle everything on your own, unassisted, or that the people who you were supposed to be able to rely on to help you weren't there. They actually required more out of you. And so that perpetuates the belief that that's all around us. Another driver is that all of this kind of stuff that we've been talking about creates moments where things feel like they are getting so far out of our control that it goes over and above our normal coping capabilities. So then what happens there is it brings on where we begin doing anxiety attacks in various ways. Now, of course, we're doing the anxiety attack because of the way we're perceiving the world. So the body is just simply responding to, in the normal way it should, when there are threats and dangers to our survival, and when we are maxed beyond capacity. So the anxiety attack is not something strange or something wrong. It's in alignment with what we're thinking and focusing on over and over all the time, and what perceptions we have coming in. So what does anxiety do to our bodies? Or as we produce anxiety, what other things is the body doing to support that? Well, one of the number one things is heart palpitations or arrhythmia. So that, of course, makes sense that our heart would begin to beat in a different way if we feel like we're in survival situations. So I'm in a survival situation, my heart is beating really fast because it's pumping blood to all my organs to say either run, freeze, or fight. So when obviously there's not a situation right in front of you that we think is our imminent danger, it's really what we're doing in our mind, then it seems strange that our heart is doing this arrhythmia or these palpitations, when it's really not strange at all. It's what's happening in your mind. The heart is doing exactly what it should be doing. So often here, there's an underlying belief that you don't deserve unconditional love and nurturing. And that is heartbreaking. And the heart has moments of panic. So let's put this all together. The perception is things are overwhelming, dangerous. I'm going to have to do this on my own. People might not be reliable. I might not have the capacity to do the thing that's being asked of me. And uniquely, this person's brain, I could even say me, I did a POTS diagnosis as well, could previously, that all of this is being perceived that way, and therefore, this feels like a threat to my life, to my being. And so my heart starts racing out of control or having this arrhythmia, and other anxiety produced symptoms happen in my body. Now, if I couple that with the belief that I'm not worthy of care, nurturing, or love, or that there's actually going to be nobody out there for me, that puts me in a state of panic, because now it feels like my body is against me. My body's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Now, again, that's perception, because your body's actually doing exactly what it should be doing, considering what's happening in your mind. So in one sense, perfect storm, right? Okay, another driver is that you may feel that you are solely responsible, accountable, and capable of handling everything and taking care of everyone in your life. You feel that you are always giving, but rarely receiving. So this is sometimes what happens when, rather than being the more, boy, I can't handle this, and it seems maybe you take on a sickly persona or a weak persona or an incapable persona. So this particular individual would take on the I can do it all. They way overcommit. They're way overly invested in helping in everybody's lives. And they don't just help, they take it on personally and take it into their own bodies. And they operate very strongly within control. So rather than help, they try to control. It feels like help for them because they would love to feel in control. The fact of the matter is they feel so out of control, they try to control everything that's outside of them to get that semblance of control. And in those ways of functioning, that feels like always giving, never receiving back. Now, because your autonomic nervous system has been wired for hypervigilance, anxiety, and this perception of danger, hardship, pain, right? The perceived hardship and the perceived danger does eventually affect your actual capacity, because what's happening in your mind that creates that hypervigilance and that anxiety and that panic and all of those different things in your body. So it's very real. And then what happens is, for this individual, normal things for other people affect you more. So you may feel more tired or exhausted than it seems like other people feel doing maybe even a minor part of day-to-day life. Now, the way you perceive that is it aligns with, oh, yep, there you go. There's something wrong. There's something wrong with me. Or we are weak. We are incapable of love. We are not worthy of being given to because look how I'm producing back and giving in such a compromised way. And we have this sort of relationship around weakness. Now, of course, that only reinforces the basic driver that there is something wrong with you and always has been. So it just plays that same loop. Another possible driver for POTS is that your past trauma has become part of your identity. So to let that go means losing a part of yourself. This will feel counterintuitive to pursue because subconsciously you feel already undervalued, undernourished. So then losing more of yourself would feel extremely dangerous, even if that more of yourself is a victimized, disempowered relationship with your body or with this particular illness. So it's much safer for people to have this disease or syndrome to become part of their identity, because it gives them the boundaries and the excuse that I don't have the capacity. And it becomes the thing that holds the boundaries and the personal boundaries and the no that they feel incapable of themselves giving. So that's what the syndrome does for them. To let that go feels very threatening. So you can maybe hear around this, another common denominator with POTS is that there's a major relationship with powerlessness. So there's an intrinsic feeling of being ultimately powerless. We're powerless to what's happening around us. And then because of the anxiety that's being produced and the panic within, we begin to feel powerless with what happens inside. So we're powerless outside, we're powerless inside. And that just creates similar to the Civil War soldiers, of a stuckness, a trappedness. There's no way to win here. There's war. There's no safety. So for people who want to heal, it's important to assess at some point, oftentimes with a trained practitioner, so that we can get into the subconscious aspects of this. To whom or what have you given your power to, and why? And oftentimes this goes back to childhood in ways that you didn't even realize, again, because it was your norm, it was your foundation, it was what your family probably did, and possibly for generations. So you would have never thought to question it. So who did you give your power to and why? It's a really good place to start. It's also common that there's an old trauma that hasn't been fully resolved. So to cope with this, you develop a belief that you need hardship or challenge to feel worthy for something, or for something to be worthy of your time. So this belief in this program is almost as if hardship has become your primary motivator. So subconsciously, you will need to perceive everything you approach with as hard, difficult, or challenging to be willing to even engage with it. In fact, it's often the case that you will be the one that creates the hardship within the relationship or the situation to keep a motivator there to stay with it. Now, if we look at the common symptoms of POTS, it all makes sense from a metaphysical standpoint. Dizziness, lightheadedness, heart palpitations, chest pain, shortness of breath, shaking, sweating, fainting, and then also oftentimes severe fatigue. These are all things that the body is doing to keep someone lying down and disengaged from their world. Because subconsciously, their world and the way they perceive it has become a war zone. The body is trying to keep them from engaging in that battle any longer. So postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, is also often associated with other conditions. So common comorbidities are migraines, IBS, EDS, or the Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, asthma, fibromyalgia, and Raynaud's phenomenon. That's just a few. Also like mast cell activation, Hashimoto's, celiac, Sjogren's, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and there's quite a few more. But from a mind change perspective, that simply means that you have many overlapping drivers and that the body has been trying to get your attention in many different ways. So if it's doing one condition or one set of symptoms and you do not listen to it, then it's going to keep trying to get your attention, which might then add another set of symptoms. We think this is just the cascade of autoimmune disorders. But what's really happening is the body is attempting in numerous times, in numerous ways, to reach out and connect with you again, to try to keep you safe in a better way than you're doing currently. And so the way out of this condition, as with most instances of disease or syndromes in the body, is by going back inside the mind, inside the subconscious programming that helped us develop these programs and conditions in the first place. So through mind change, what we're going to go after is those initial received or perceived messages from parents or caregivers that communicated a lack of support or a lack of worth or value. When we rewrite and rewire those messages, then we can input something different there. And oftentimes we don't input anything, it just shows up. And in the end, our goal is to put the power back where it belongs, back in you. And this means that you end up being the biggest support for you. All right, I look forward to seeing you guys every other week as we continue to dive into the Emotional Driver series. Please, again, make sure that you leave those 5-star reviews and comment on a disease, symptom, or ailment that you would like to hear covered. And as a reminder, you can sign up for the podcast newsletter on our website and receive 10% off private one-to-one sessions with one of our qualified practitioners. Until next time, thanks for joining us on the Mind Change Podcast, where we are changing the world, one mind at a time.